All right, here we go. Video for the civil rights part of the course on Watergate. So today I'm going to be talking about Watergate, what the Watergate scandal was, and quite importantly, what the effects were. Because obviously one of the big things to do with the whole Watergate scandal is not just what it was, but what the effects were, what the impact was of Watergate on America in general and specific parts of the Watergate scandal as well. So, first things first, first thing you really do need to know about, we have looked at Watergate, obviously, year 11, but the first thing you really do need to know about is what the Watergate scandal actually was. So, the Watergate scandal obviously all starts with President Richard Nixon. It all focuses around him, around actions that he did, and people who were associated with him did. How much of the Watergate break-in he was aware of before it happened is debatable, but certainly the whole thing surrounds Richard Nixon. Now, a bit of context for you. Nixon had lost the 1960 presidential election against John F. Kennedy by just over 100,000 votes. Now, when you think about the size of America and how many people actually vote in American elections, it's millions and millions and millions of people. So to lose an election, a presidential election, by just over 100,000 votes, that's really, really close, really close. So it was one of the closest elections, or US elections anyway, on record. So he'd lost that 1960 election to John F. Kennedy, and then even when he'd won the presidency, when he'd won the presidential election in 1968, that election itself was also very, very close. So Nixon's experienced two very close elections. He's lost in 1960 by literally just over 100,000 votes, and he's won in 1968 by, again, a very close margin. So when it came to the 1972 election, when Nixon was fighting for re-election, clearly he was worried, because, the experiences that he'd had in terms of US presidential elections, and, he wanted to win this, and he wanted to win it comfortably, and he wanted to win this at any cost. So what Nixon did, one of the things that he did anyway, to try and get re-elected, was he established this group of people, this organization called CREEP, although CREEP was kind of the nickname that it ended up kind of achieving, which was the Committee for the Re-Election of the President. Now, CREEP, Committee for Re-Election of the President, were tasked with, well, kind of doing what it says on the tin, really. Their task was getting the president, in this case Nixon, re-elected. Now, CREEP itself was a legal organisation. There's nothing illegal about it, or rather, it's perfectly legal for the president to have a group of people working for them to try and get them re-elected. There's nothing illegal about that. However, what CREEP did or ended up doing, as well as some legal activities, let's not say everything they were doing was illegal, but as well as some legal activities, what CREEP ended up doing was they did carry out several certainly immoral and in some cases illegal activities, such as, got a big list here of things that CREEP did, or a relatively big list anyway. One of the things that they did do was they discredited the Democratic candidate Edmund Muskie. Now, if you look on page 98 of the textbook, there's a bit more detail on that, but essentially they kind of made up a story about Edmund Muskie and about his wife, which was very damaging, and this whole thing got out, and how true it was is quite debatable, but Muskie himself as a candidate kind of became discredited. He became a lot of people kind of lost support for Muskie because he was seen as quite a weak candidate. If you look, as I said, if you look on page 98, there's some detail on this, but Creep, were responsible for this story about Edmund Muskie and Edmund Muskie's wife getting out, and that really damaged Muskie's campaign. And Muskie was seen as quite a strong candidate before this happened. So that was certainly one of the more immoral things that Creep did. Another thing that they did, which is very much illegal, was break-ins and criminal surveillance, e.g., I'm sure, year 11, you're all aware of what I'm talking about here. One example of this, of these break-ins and criminal surveillance was where they broke into the Democratic offices in the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. in 1971. Obviously, the purpose of this, when they broke into when Creep sent the group that became known as the White House Plumbers. When they got into the Democratic offices, their job was to plant bugs and listening devices to listen into what the Democrats were doing. So if the Democrats were planning something, planning a policy or planning something on planning their campaign, or if they were, this was kind of the main aim of it, if anything kind of came out in the Democratic offices where the Democrats were discussing something that they didn't want to be made public, dirt, like things that you don't want to come out, they were discussing that in secret, or what they thought was in secret and in private. The aim was Creep were trying to listen into this and try and, as I say, find the dirt and find the damaging information that they could then release out into the public and say, oh, the Democrats are this, and, the Democrats have got these dirty secrets and these things and whatnot. And again, really damage the reputation of the Democratic Party. So that, again, was another kind of illegal, well, not kind of, it was an illegal thing that Creep were doing as part of this campaign. Now, the initial break-ins have been successful. Initially, the plan to plant these bugs and listening devices was successful. They did break into the Democratic offices in the Watergate complex, and they did plant these bugs and these listening devices, the plumbers who were tasked with it. But what happened was, in June 1972, one of these bugs was broken, or it wasn't working. So they were breaking kind of back into the offices to repair these bugs. And that was when 5 men anyway got caught breaking into the offices. And, that's when they were caught. That's when the game was up. Even though they planted the bugs, or this bug in particular, they planted it about a month before. So when they were breaking back into the offices to repair these bugs and listening devices, that's when, as I say, they got caught. Now, why, here's one of the big questions, why was this scandal so significant? Well, quite simply, even though it's not, as I said before, it's not clear how much Nixon knew about the break-in before it happened. He might have known all about it, he might not have known about it at all. That's not really the point. The reason why this is such a big scandal is because he certainly did, as you're going to see in a minute, he certainly did know about the cover-up that followed. So whether he knew about the break-in or not, he certainly did know about he was part of the attempt to cover up the investigation. In other words, he was complicit, or he was guilty of trying to cover up the activities, the illegal activities anyway, of what Creep were doing. And as you well know, this eventually led to Nixon's resignation. But how? How did this lead to Richard Nixon's resignation? Because if you rewind a little bit, Nixon actually ended up winning the 1972 election in November of 1972 by a landslide. It was a huge win. It was an absolutely massive win for him. It was, as I say, a landslide. And the break-in had happened in June 1972. So it had happened, 4 or 5 months before the election. So clearly the actual break-in didn't have an effect, or a massive effect, or any effect really on the election, because, as I say, he won at an absolute landslide. But what happened was, after the break-in was reported, two journalists from the Washington Post newspaper called Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein investigated this break-in. They really investigated it in a lot of detail. And eventually, they were the ones who traced this break-in, this burglary, back to Creep. So their digging eventually led back to Creep. They found a trace back to Creep and realised that they were the ones who had done this. Now, when all this was emerging, this is where the scandal really kind of hots up. When all this was emerging, Nixon attempted to halt the investigation. He tried to stop this investigation happening and taking place, which straight away indicated that something was wrong here, because what Nixon was doing here is, what's known as obstruction of justice. He was trying to stop this investigation happening into something illegal. And, that straight away, looked a bit fishy. Why is the president trying to stop this investigation into this illegal break-in in the Watergate complex? What's going on? Now, in January 1973, the Watergate burglars, the men who'd been caught breaking into the Watergate complex, were found guilty. And in March 1973, as they were being sentenced, here you go, the judge in charge of the case received information, or evidence anyway, that the defendants had been paid to stay silent and plead guilty, which again was clear evidence of a cover-up. So it all comes out. These guys have been paid money and told to plead guilty and basically keep their mouth shut and not drop anybody else in it. That all comes to light. And that, again, is a big red flag. Clearly something's going on here. Clearly people, very important people, high up people, are trying to keep these guys quiet. What's going on? What's the big picture? Now, Nixon continued to maintain his innocence. All the way through, he said, I'm innocent, I've got nothing to do with this. But in July 1973, a White House aide revealed that Nixon had secretly taped every single conversation. I put here conversations, but it was every single conversation that had taken place in the Oval Office in the White House, the Oval Office being one of the main offices used by the president. So every single conversation that had taken place in the Oval Office during Nixon's presidency had been recorded. And this eventually led to the tapes, these tapes that had been recorded in the Oval Office being handed over to the Senate's investigators. Because obviously, when this came out, the people investigating this were like, well, we want to hear those tapes. We want to hear the conversations that have been going on. We want to find out if Nixon has been involved in this. So once all the tapes have been handed over, I put here a ... because Nixon initially refused to hand these tapes over. He said, the president, he claimed all kinds of things. One, it's the president's right to kind of some privacy. Also, in these discussions that have been taking place in the Oval Office, things may have been said that are, matters of national security. There might be things in these tapes that I don't want people to know for various reasons. So initially he completely refused to hand them over. Then after that he handed over edited transcripts of them. So they were typed out, as transcripts are, but they were edited. Things were taken out. But eventually, long story short, so I put there ... one tape, once they were all handed in, one tape did prove that Nixon had ordered the cover-up. There was rock solid evidence that Nixon was well aware of the cover-up and was actively encouraging it. So that was when, he was very much banged to rights. It was obvious that he was guilty. And from that point on, he was on the verge of being impeached, which, as you know, is put on trial. And the president's put on trial. I mean, it's happened quite recently, twice, to the previous president of America. So this is something that you're probably fairly well aware of. So very much on the verge of being impeached. And in order to kind of avoid being impeached, in August 1974, Nixon resigned. And so far, as of 2024, Nixon is the only president to have resigned ever. So the first president to resign, and so far the only president to resign. And he was replaced by this man here. It's a bit of a blurred picture, but he was replaced by this man here, Gerald Ford, his vice president, who'd only been his vice president for a few months, actually, at that point. So it's quite a stroke of luck for Gerald Ford, kind of walking into the presidency. So he was replaced by Gerald Ford, who pardoned Nixon. Once Ford was president, he pardoned Richard Nixon. Reason for that was kind of, I want to bury Watergate. I want to kind of move on. America needs to move on, which, didn't really do Gerald Ford any favours, because it looked like he was just as dirty as his predecessor. But obviously, once he pardoned Nixon, that meant that Nixon was immune from prosecution. Nixon couldn't be, put up on trial for these things that he'd done wrong. Now, most importantly, as I said at the start of the video, for me anyway, the most important thing about Watergate is not so much what happened, but the key thing is, and this is the kind of thing you could get a question on, whether it's an 8 marker or even a 16 marker, what were the effects of Watergate? This is a common 8 mark question or even a 16 mark question about what the effects of Watergate were, or what the most significant effects of Watergate were. And there's loads of them. There's loads of effects of Watergate. It has a huge, huge, huge effect on several areas of life, amongst other things. First and foremost, Watergate has a huge effect on, it does huge damage to the standing of the office of the presidency, i.e., people now from 1972, 73 onwards were much less trusting of the president. Beforehand, you could call this a bit of naivety. Beforehand, the president was seen as a person of, very high standing and very trustworthy, and, very much kind of, almost the father, because I've only had male presidents, the father of the nation, and, someone who really can be trusted, someone who the nation can put their trust in. And from Watergate onwards, a lot of people are going, well, actually, the president has, in this case, committed some terrible, crimes. And, therefore, can we really trust the person who is the president? So there was a real damage to that position and the trust that people put in that position. And in fact, a kind of knock on from this, or one of the knock-ons from this, was in 1978, there was an act passed by Congress called the Ethics in Government Act. And this Ethics in Government Act, forced government officials, not just the president, but any government official, to make the finances of their work publicly available. So they had to be crystal clear about what they were spending their money on. And it also set limits on the work that people could do once they'd left government jobs, to stop them taking advantage of any classified information they may have learned. So they can't, if people work in government jobs and they find out things that, aren't public knowledge, this limited the kind of jobs they could go and work in afterwards, because there might be positions where they could profit from that or really take advantage of that. So in short, people were much less trusting of, as I say, the president, but also much less trusting of, the government. They were less trusting of the government, huge distrust of the government. People were now a lot more cynical, for want of a better word, of politicians. They were a lot more cynical about politicians. And in fact, this was reflected very much in the media, because, as you'd seen here, the Washington Post were responsible for kind of revealing what was going on with the Watergate scandal. And the media were a lot quicker, and they still are, even in 2024, they were a lot quicker to, look for further scandals involving the government, involving politicians, particularly the president. Again, we saw it, relatively recently with Hillary Clinton, when she was running for the presidency against Donald Trump a few years ago. So the media were a lot quicker to kind of, again, look for the dirt on politicians and report it, even if there wasn't an awful lot of proof. So this kind of cynicism and again, distrust of politicians in general really spread and grew from that point on. Another effect, it's a fairly obvious one, but another effect of Watergate and the Watergate scandal was that in 1976, at the next presidential election, the Democrats won. And in fact, the person who was voted in as president to replace Gerald Ford was Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter, he's an interesting figure, Jimmy Carter, because he came from a fairly he was a senator, but he came from a fairly simplistic background. He was a peanut farmer. So he had a very kind of, for want of a better word, simple background. He wasn't seen as one of the Washington set like Nixon had been. Nixon had been a major political figure since, the 50s. He'd been involved in McCarthyism. He'd been a member of HUAC. He'd been a senator. He'd been vice president. He'd been vice president to Dwight Eisenhower. He'd obviously gone up against Kennedy in 1960 and then became president. So Jimmy Carter, this very, as I say, kind of ordinary American, was voted in as, he was a politician, but still a very ordinary looking American, was voted in 1976. Democrats did very well. And obviously the flip side to that is that the Republicans, their reputation was very badly damaged. I mean, it didn't really help that one of the first things that Gerald Ford had done had been to pardon Nixon, but there you go. Speaking of reputations being damaged, and again, this is a fairly obvious effect of Watergate, but one of the big effects of Watergate was that Nixon's reputation was severely damaged. Nixon had been, up until, and this is kind of shown by the fact that he won the 1972 election so comfortably. Nixon, up until Watergate, had been seen as a pretty good president. He'd had quite a few successes. He'd improved relations with China, cooling down the Cold War somewhat. He'd been the president during the moon landings. His government had waged war on organised crime and had a lot of success there. He was the president that withdrew America from Vietnam. So all of those things that can be, seen as successes, they were forgotten. Now if you Google Richard Nixon, one of the first things, if not the first thing that comes up is Watergate. It's the first thing that people associate with Nixon. If you stop people on the street, a bit random to stop people on the street and ask them about Richard Nixon, but if you stop people on the street and ask them about Richard Nixon, guarantee you most of them, if not all of them, the first thing they'll think about is Watergate. It's the thing that he is associated with, and it really does, damage his reputation. People forget the more successful things that he'd been associated with. And in fact, developing on from that, Nixon, it kind of is given this nickname, this very unfortunate nickname of, if I can get the paper ready, Tricky Dicky. He's tricky, he's corrupt, he's slimy, he's not to be trusted, Tricky Dicky. He's very much, again, I've talked about this already about, if you Google Nixon, it'll come up with Watergate. Nixon is very much a laughingstock president in many people's eyes. For instance, the character of Milhouse in The Simpsons, who's a bit of a kind of, pathetic character, for want of a better phrase. He's only called Milhouse because Nixon's middle name was Milhouse. He was Richard Milhouse Nixon. And The Simpsons creator has admitted that he got the name Milhouse from that. That is kind of a nod to, Nixon's a bit of an idiot. And there are loads of, countless references in movies and TV, to Nixon. A load of people from kind of the mid-70s onwards have been, seen doing the impression of Nixon going, "I'm not a crook," and all this kind of stuff, mimicking Nixon's famous speech where he used those exact words. He said, "I'm not a crook." And obviously it turned out that he was. So Nixon is very much a bit of a laughingstock president. Also, rather more sinisterly or darkly, if that's a word, Nixon's reputation as a person is also damaged because the tapes, when they were revealed, highlighted some pretty horrendous things that he'd been saying in the Oval Office. He'd come out with very sexist views, racist views, homophobic views. As we saw not so long ago in the textbook, it mentioned that he swore so often in these tapes, in conversation, that when the transcripts were released, it'd say expletive deleted, and it was included so much in these transcripts that, again, that became a bit of a joke, Richard expletive deleted Nixon. So here's this, quite uncouth president who, as I say, swears a lot. He's sexist, he's racist, he's homophobic. So again, clearly the whole Watergate scandal dirtied Richard Nixon's name and his legacy, ultimately. And finally, another big effect of Watergate was there was a plethora, a huge amount of new legislation, new laws. This was a direct attempt to prevent a scandal like Watergate happening again, because obviously America's reputation was damaged. America, who, this is still during the Cold War, America waving the flag, saying we are, our government is at the forefront of, everything. We are the land of the free, home of the brave, and all this kind of stuff. We've got the best government, and we can be trusted. And clearly this kind of goes against that. So there was a real attempt to prevent another scandal like Watergate happening again. So loads of new laws were passed as a result. I've already mentioned the Ethics in Government Act in 1978, which limited the president's spending powers and things like that. But here are some more. There's loads of them, absolutely loads of them. So you've got, in 1973, the House and Senate open meeting rule. So all committee meetings, if there's a Senate meeting or a Congress meeting, all committee meetings had to be open to the public. So the public could either go and watch these meetings taking place, or the minutes of the meeting detailing what had been discussed had to be made available to the public. So that was one of them. There was another one here, also in 1973, the War Powers Act, which stopped a president going to war without the approval of Congress. So to this day, if the president wants to go to war with someone, a country, he or she has to get Congress to vote on it. He or she can't just go, right, we're going to war with whoever or whatnot. Another law that was kind of a result of Watergate was in 1974. There was the Election Campaign Act, which set limits on election campaign spending and contributions. Again, Watergate has kind of come about as a result of that. The campaign for the re-election the campaign to get President Nixon re-elected. Here, there's a limit on how much the candidates for president can actually spend on that. Another one, quite a significant one, in 1974, there's the Freedom of Information Act, which gave people, American people anyway, the right to access government documents in which they featured. So if you were mentioned for whatever reason in a government document, you had the right to access that document and see exactly what the government had on you or what they were saying about you. Another one, kind of like a similar one, is the 1974 Privacy Act, which set rules on how the government could collect information on individuals. So again, making laws on just how the government could access your information, your personal information. Also in 1974, quite a big year for acts that year, 1974, there was the Congressional Budget Control Act, which set rules on how the president could use government money, because part of CREEP's funding had come from government money. So again, this said what the president can use government money for and what they can't use it for. And finally, you've also got the 1976 National Emergencies Act, which introduced checks and balances on the president's powers, including limiting their ability to use emergency power to just 2 years. So again, you can't have a president going, right, we've got a big national crisis. I say there's going to be emergency powers and they're going to last indefinitely. This said you can only use those powers for 2 years. Clearly, you don't have to remember all of those acts. There's loads of them. If you remember one or two of those going into the exam, then you're doing pretty well. But all of those acts combined, clearly, the key point is they clearly reflect, again, this real distrust of government. What are the government doing? What are they doing with our information? Can we trust that they're spending money properly, etc., etc.? So there was a huge impact, on US politics in general. We've seen the president's position questioned and the government's position questioned, and these laws, as I say, are at the very least an indirect result of Watergate, but more than likely they're a direct result of Watergate, because the US government are, worried about the way they are being perceived by their own people and beyond. So all that is Watergate. That's Watergate. That's what happened. It's the Watergate scandal. It's the effects of Watergate. There's loads more information on Watergate, on both those areas, what happened, the investigation and the work of the Washington Post and everything in the textbook. And there's some more information on the effects of Watergate as well in the textbook. So don't just rely on this video for your Watergate studying and revision. Do use the textbook too. But I hope it's been useful. I hope that's cleared up a few issues with Watergate, because we only, Year 11, spent couple of lessons looking at it, so hopefully that's half an hour that's clarified a few things. Hope the revision's going well. Keep at it. If you've got, again, comment sections open below, so if you have any requests for videos, then leave them down there below. But I hope everything's going okay. Take care, and I will see you soon. Thank you.